She walked into the room and felt her stomach drop. Not because anything was wrong, but because she'd been here before. Not in this life. Not in this body. But she'd stood in this exact spot, looked at this exact view, felt this exact feeling, and she knew, with absolute certainty, what was about to happen next. The hypnotherapist's voice was distant, guiding her backward through time. Jennifer felt the familiar sensation of letting go, of her conscious mind stepping aside to let something deeper come forward. Her breathing slowed, her muscles relaxed. The room around her faded into something softer, something dreamlike. But this time was different. Instead of going back to childhood like she expected, instead of accessing memories from earlier in this life, she felt herself falling through layers of time, decades, centuries. The sensation was like dropping through water. Each layer a different temperature, a different density. And then she landed. Not physically. Her body was still in the therapist's chair, but her awareness landed somewhere else. Somewhere else. The air smelled different here, wood smoke and horses and something earthy she couldn't name. The sounds were different too. No cars, no electricity humming in the background. Just wind and distant voices and the creak of wooden wheels on cobblestone. She looked down at her hands. They weren't her hands. These hands were rougher, darker, marked by years of manual labor. Jennifer had started therapy because of panic attacks. They'd begun 6 months ago, right after she'd moved into a new apartment. Nothing traumatic had happened. The move had gone smoothly. The apartment was nice, better than her old place. But from the first day, she'd felt this overwhelming sense of dread she couldn't explain. The panic attacks always followed the same pattern. She'd be doing something ordinary, cooking dinner, or reading a book, and suddenly her chest would tighten. Her breathing would become shallow. Her hands would start shaking. And she'd be flooded with this absolute certainty that something terrible was about to happen, but nothing ever did. The terrible thing never came. Yet the feeling wouldn't go away. It was always there, lurking beneath the surface, ready to explode into full panic at random moments. Her regular therapist had tried everything: cognitive behavioral therapy, breathing exercises, medication. Nothing worked. Finally, she'd suggested past life regression as a last resort. Maybe there was some trauma from a previous lifetime bleeding through, creating these inexplicable feelings. Jennifer had been skeptical. She'd never really believed in reincarnation. But she was desperate. So here she was, lying in a chair in Dr. Michael Torres's office, accessing what seemed to be a genuine past life memory. Now, standing in this other time, this other place, she felt the panic rising again. That same terrible certainty, that same dread. But this time, she understood why. Because she'd been here before. And she knew how this story ended. The knowledge came without words, without conscious thought, just a deep, bone-level knowing. She was about to experience something she'd experienced before. Not just once, but multiple times across multiple lifetimes. A pattern that her soul kept repeating, over and over, trying to learn something. Trying to break free from something, trying to understand something that kept eluding her. Jennifer's awareness settled more fully into this other body, this other life. Her name was Mary. She was 32 years old. The year was 1847, and she lived in a small village in Ireland during the height of the potato famine. Mary was a widow. Her husband Patrick had died 2 years earlier from the fever that swept through the village. She had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Sean was 10. Thomas was 7, and little Bridget was only 4. They were all she had left in the world. The famine had been devastating. The potato crop, which everyone depended on, had failed for 3 years in a row. A blight had destroyed the plants, turning them black and rotten in the ground. People were starving. Entire families were dying. The village that had once been full of life and laughter was now a place of gaunt faces and hollow eyes. Mary had managed to keep her children alive through careful rationing and occasional charity from the local church, but supplies were running out. The church had less and less to give, and Mary was facing an impossible decision. There was a ship leaving for America in 3 days. The landlord, an English lord who owned most of the land in the area, was offering passage to anyone who could work off the cost once they arrived. It was a chance to escape, to find a place where there was food, where her children wouldn't starve. But the journey was dangerous. Many died on the ships, packed into filthy holds with barely enough food or water. They called them coffin ships for a reason. And even if they survived the crossing, America was unknown. Mary had heard stories of opportunity, but also stories of hardship, of Irish immigrants being treated as less than human, of families being separated. She had to choose: stay in Ireland and watch her children slowly starve, or risk everything on a dangerous journey to an unknown land. Jennifer, experiencing all of this through Mary's consciousness, felt the weight of that choice crushing down on her. She recognized the feeling. It was the same dread, the same panic that she experienced in her current life, the feeling of being trapped, of having to make an impossible choice, of knowing that no matter what she decided, something terrible might happen. Mary made her decision. She would take her children to America. It was a risk, but staying was certain death. At least, the ship offered hope. The next 3 days passed in a blur of preparation. Mary sold everything they owned, which wasn't much. A few pieces of furniture, some cooking pots, Patrick's tools. She used the money to buy what supplies she could for the journey. Hardtack, dried meat, a waterskin. Not enough, never enough, but all she could afford. The morning they left, Mary stood at the door of the cottage she'd lived in her entire life. The cottage where she'd been born, where she'd married Patrick, where her children had been born. She knew she'd never see it again. Knew she was leaving behind not just a place, but an entire way of life. A connection to ancestors who had lived on this land for generations. But she had no choice. The land had betrayed them. The potatoes had failed. The English landlords showed no mercy. It was leave or die. The walk to the port took 2 days. The children were weak from hunger. Moving slowly, Mary carried Bridget most of the way, feeling her daughter's tiny body growing lighter, frailer. Sean and Thomas stumbled along behind her, their faces blank with exhaustion. When they finally reached the ship, Mary's heart sank. It was smaller than she'd imagined, older, more decrepit. The deck was already crowded with desperate families, hundreds of people pushing and shoving to get aboard. The smell coming from the hold was terrible, human waste and rotting food and disease. But she'd come this far, couldn't turn back now. She clutched her children close and pushed through the crowd, showing the landlord's agent the papers that proved they had the right to board. They were herded down into the hold like animals. The space was impossibly cramped, barely enough room to lie down. There were no separate quarters, no privacy, just one large dark space filled with suffering humanity. People were already sick down here, coughing and moaning in the darkness. Mary found a small space against the wall and gathered her children around her. "We'll be all right," she told them, trying to sound confident. "It's only 6 weeks. We can survive 6 weeks. And then we'll be in America, where there's food and opportunity. You'll see, it'll be worth it." But even as she said the words, she didn't believe them. The panic was rising in her chest again. That certainty that something terrible was coming, that she'd made the wrong choice, that her children would die because of her decision. The ship departed the next morning. The journey was worse than anything Mary could have imagined. The hold was airless and stifling. People got sick immediately. Dysentery, typhoid, cholera. The diseases spread rapidly in the cramped, filthy conditions. Every day bodies were carried up from the hold and thrown overboard. Every night, Mary lay awake listening to the coughing and moaning and crying of the dying. She tried to keep her children clean and fed, but it was impossible. The water ration was barely enough to drink, let alone wash with. The food was moldy and full of weevils. Bridget stopped eating after the first week, too weak to chew the hard biscuits. Jennifer felt Mary's desperation like it was her own. The helpless rage at watching her daughter fade away. The guilt of having brought them on this cursed journey. The knowledge that she'd made the wrong choice, that they would have been better off dying quickly in Ireland rather than slowly in this floating hell. 3 weeks into the journey, Bridget died. She simply went to sleep one night in Mary's arms and didn't wake up. Mary held her small body for hours, refusing to accept it, refusing to let them take her daughter away. But eventually, the ship's crew forced her to release the body. They wrapped Bridget in a piece of sailcloth and threw her into the ocean. Mary felt something break inside her when her daughter disappeared beneath the waves, a part of her soul that would never heal. She'd failed. She demade the choice that was supposed to save them, and instead she de-killed her baby girl. Thomas got sick next. Fever, vomiting, the same symptoms that had claimed dozens of others. Mary nursed him desperately, giving him her own water ration, trying every folk remedy she knew, but nothing helped. He died 4 days later. 2 children gone. 2 of her babies thrown into the ocean, and Sean was starting to show symptoms too. The same hollow cough, the same glassy eyes. Mary couldn't take it anymore. The guilt, the grief, the overwhelming sense that this was all her fault. She'd brought them here. She'd made the choice, and because of that choice, her children were dying. One night, while Sean slept fitfully beside her, Mary climbed up to the deck. It was dark, the ocean stretching endlessly in every direction. She stood at the rail and looked down at the black water rushing past the hull. It would be so easy. Just climb over. Let the ocean take her like it had taken Bridget and Thomas. End the pain. End the guilt. End the terrible knowledge that she'd failed as a mother, failed in the most fundamental way possible. Jennifer felt Mary's suicidal despair, felt the pull of the ocean, the desire to just stop existing. And she realized this was it. This was the moment. The pattern she'd been repeating. In this life as Mary, she'd made a choice, and that choice had led to tragedy. And in response to that tragedy, she'd wanted to end her own life. But Mary didn't jump. At the last moment, she heard Sean calling for her from below, his voice weak and scared. "Mama, where are you?" She couldn't leave him. Not while he was still alive. Not while there was still a chance. She climbed back down to the hold and held her surviving son close, whispering promises she didn't know if she could keep. Sean survived. Barely. By the time they reached America, he was skeletal, more dead than alive, but he was breathing. He had made it. Mary and Sean stumbled off the ship into a new world. But Mary was hollow inside. She'd saved one child, but lost 2. The grief and guilt would never leave her. Every day for the rest of her life, she would wonder if she'd made the right choice. Would wonder if her children would still be alive if she'd stayed in Ireland. Would wonder if the temporary suffering of starvation would have been better than the prolonged horror of that ship. Jennifer watched the rest of Mary's life unfold in flashes. Sean grew up, found work, eventually married. Mary lived with him and his family, helping raise grandchildren she never truly felt connected to. She existed but didn't really live. The light had gone out of her when Bridget and Thomas died. She was just going through the motions until death finally came for her at age 6. But that wasn't the end. As Mary's life faded, Jennifer felt herself being pulled backward again, dropping through time to another life, another body, another version of herself. This time she was a man named James, living in London in 1665. The plague had come to the city. James was a merchant with a wife and 2 children, and once again, he faced an impossible choice: stay in the disease-ridden city where his business and livelihood were, or flee to the countryside where it was safer but he'd lose everything he'd worked to build. James chose to stay. He thought he could protect his family, thought he could keep them safe if they just stayed inside, avoided contact with the sick. But the plague didn't care about precautions. His wife got sick first, then his son. Both died within days of each other. His daughter survived, but James was consumed by guilt. He'd made the wrong choice. Should have left when he had the chance. The pattern continued. Jennifer was pulled through more lives, more versions of herself, all facing similar situations. Impossible choices where there was no right answer. Decisions that led to loss and tragedy no matter which option was chosen. And in each life, the same crushing guilt, the same sense of having failed, the same belief that if only they'd chosen differently, their loved ones would have survived. She was a mother in ancient Rome, choosing between surrendering her son to slavery or watching him be killed by soldiers. She was a father in feudal Japan, deciding whether to flee with his family during a civil war or stay and defend their ancestral home. She was a woman in 1930s Germany, trying to decide if it was safe to stay or if they should abandon everything and run. In every life, the choice led to loss. In every life, she blamed herself. In every life, she carried the guilt until death. And in every life, that guilt became the seed for the next incarnation, drawing her back to similar situations, similar choices, similar outcomes. Jennifer understood now. This was her soul's pattern, her karmic loop. She kept incarnating into situations where she had to make impossible choices, where she had to decide between staying or leaving, between safety and risk, between the known and the unknown. And no matter what she chose, people she loved suffered. The pattern wasn't about the specific circumstances. It wasn't about famines or plagues or wars. It was about the feeling, the terrible weight of responsibility, the guilt of making a choice that led to harm, the belief that she was fundamentally flawed, fundamentally incapable of protecting the people she loved. And that belief, that deep soul-level conviction that she would always make the wrong choice, was what kept pulling her back into similar situations lifetime after lifetime. She was trying to fix it, trying to find the right choice, trying to prove to herself that she could protect her loved ones if she just chose correctly. But there was no right choice. That was the lesson she'd missed across all these lifetimes. Some situations didn't have good options. Some circumstances were just tragic, no matter what you did, and blaming yourself for outcomes you couldn't control was pointless, destructive, and kept you trapped in patterns that served no one. Jennifer found herself back in Mary's consciousness, back on that ship, standing at the rail looking at the dark ocean. But this time, she wasn't just experiencing Mary's perspective. She was aware of all the other lives too, all the other versions of herself who had faced impossible choices and blamed themselves for the outcomes. And suddenly, with a clarity that felt like lightning striking, she understood. Mary hadn't killed her children. The famine had killed them. The disease on the ship had killed them. The cruel economic system that forced people to choose between starvation and death ships had killed them. Mary had done the best she could with the information and resources she had. That's all anyone could do. If she'd stayed in Ireland, her children likely would have died anyway, slowly and painfully from starvation. If she'd gone to America, which she did, 2 of them died but 1 survived. There was no universe where all of them lived, no perfect choice that would have prevented all suffering. The situation itself was impossible. And carrying guilt for an impossible situation was like carrying water in a basket, pointless and exhausting. Jennifer felt a presence beside her, not physical, but real nonetheless, a being of light and compassion, what some might call a guide or guardian angel. The presence spoke, not with words but with direct understanding. You have been punishing yourself for lifetimes, carrying guilt that was never yours to carry, taking responsibility for outcomes you couldn't control. This pattern has served you in one way. It has made you deeply compassionate, deeply sensitive to others' suffering, but it has also kept you trapped, kept you from living fully, kept you from accepting that you are not responsible for everything that happens to everyone you love. The presence showed her something, a vision of all her lifetimes laid out like a tapestry, each thread a different life, each life connected to the others through this central pattern of impossible choices and undeserved guilt. And Jennifer saw that she could choose differently now, not in the past lives, those were complete, but in this current life, as Jennifer. She could break the pattern. She could choose to release the guilt. She could accept that sometimes life presents no good options, that sometimes people suffer despite our best efforts, that sometimes the most loving thing we can do is forgive ourselves for being human, for being limited, for not being able to prevent all harm. The panic attacks she'd been experiencing in her current life, they were echoes of this pattern. She'd moved into a new apartment, a choice that felt significant even though logically it was just a move. But her soul, carrying the weight of all these past lives, interpreted it as another impossible choice, another chance to fail, another opportunity for guilt. The apartment itself didn't matter. The panic wasn't about the apartment. It was about the deep belief that any choice she made would lead to disaster, that she was fundamentally incapable of making good decisions, that tragedy followed her because she was flawed. But she wasn't flawed. She was just human. And humans can't prevent all suffering, can't control all outcomes, can't protect everyone they love from every possible harm. That's not failure. That's just the nature of existence in physical reality. Jennifer felt something shift inside her, something fundamental and profound, like a knot that had been tied for lifetimes suddenly coming loose. The guilt she'd been carrying, not just from this life but from dozens of lives, began to dissolve, not disappearing entirely. Grief and regret would always be part of the human experience, but losing its power over her, losing its ability to define her, to trap her, to keep her stuck in repeating patterns. She looked at Mary's life with new eyes, saw not a woman who had failed but a woman who had loved fiercely, who had fought desperately to save her children, who had survived unimaginable loss and still kept going for the sake of her surviving son. That was strength, not weakness. That was love, not failure. And she saw James in London, not as a fool who made the wrong choice but as a man doing his best in an impossible situation. Saw the mother in Rome, the father in Japan, the woman in Germany, all of them not as failures but as souls trying to navigate impossible circumstances with limited information and resources. They had all done the best they could. and so had she. In this current life as Jennifer, the panic attacks weren't evidence of her weakness, they were evidence of unhealed trauma from past lives. And now that she understood, now that she could see the pattern clearly, she could begin to heal. The presence beside her sent one final message. You do not need to repeat this pattern anymore. You have learned what you needed to learn. You can choose differently now. You can make choices, even difficult ones, without carrying guilt for outcomes you can't control. You can love people without believing you're responsible for protecting them from all harm. You can live fully without the constant fear that any decision you make will lead to disaster. You are released. The pattern is broken. Go forward and live without this burden. Jennifer opened her eyes in Dr. Torres's office. Her face was wet with tears, but they weren't tears of sadness. They were tears of release, of relief, of finally understanding something that had been haunting her for lifetimes. Dr. Torres sat quietly, giving her space to process. He'd been doing past life regression work for 20 years and had seen many profound healing moments. But something about Jennifer's energy told him this had been particularly significant. What did you experience? He asked gently when Jennifer seemed ready to talk. She tried to explain, but words felt inadequate. How do you describe seeing multiple lifetimes at once? How do you capture the feeling of a karmic pattern breaking? How do you express the profound relief of finally forgiving yourself for things that happened hundreds of years ago in bodies that were uneven technically yours? She did her best, and Dr. Torres listened with the deep attention of someone who understood that what he was hearing was sacred, transformative work. When she finished, he nodded slowly. Patterns are one of the most common things we see in past life regression, he explained. The soul keeps returning to similar situations, not as punishment but as opportunity. Each lifetime is a chance to see the pattern more clearly, to understand it more deeply, to eventually break free from it. But why would a soul keep choosing to experience trauma? Jennifer asked. Why would I keep putting myself in situations where I'd have to make impossible choices and lose people I loved? Dr. Torres smiled gently. Because that's how we learn and grow. Comfortable situations don't teach us much. It's the difficult experiences, the impossible choices, the deep grief that force us to develop wisdom and compassion. You didn't incarnate to be comfortable. You incarnated to evolve. And this pattern, as painful as it's been, has made you who you are, deeply empathetic, acutely aware of others' suffering, committed to making choices carefully and thoughtfully. Jennifer thought about that. It was true. In her current life, she was known for being incredibly compassionate, for being the friend people called when they were in crisis, for having a deep sensitivity to others' pain. And yes, she was also known for being indecisive, for agonizing over choices, for carrying guilt when things went wrong even when it clearly wasn't her fault. The gifts and the wounds came from the same source. The pattern had shaped her in both positive and negative ways. And now that she understood it, now that she'd chosen to release the guilt, she could keep the gifts while letting go of the wounds. The weeks after the regression were remarkable. The panic attacks stopped almost immediately. Jennifer could feel the difference in her body, in her energy. The constant low-level anxiety that had hummed beneath everything was gone. She could breathe fully for the first time in years. She also noticed changes in how she made decisions. Before, every choice had felt weighted with cosmic significance, as if one wrong move would lead to disaster. Now, she could see choices more clearly. Some decisions were important, yes, but most were just practical choices with no moral weight attached. And even the important decisions didn't carry the same terror anymore. She moved forward with things she'd been putting off, applied for a promotion at work that she'd been too afraid to pursue, reached out to reconnect with family members she'd been avoiding because of old conflicts, started dating again after 2 years of being alone. Not because everything was suddenly easy, but because she wasn't paralyzed by the fear of making wrong choices anymore. She could accept that some decisions wouldn't work out perfectly, that some relationships would end, that some risks wouldn't pay off, and that was okay. That was just life. It didn't mean she was fundamentally flawed or destined to cause harm. She also found herself drawn to helping others who struggled with similar patterns. She joined a support group for people with anxiety disorders and found that her story resonated with many of them. They might not believe in past lives or reincarnation, but they understood the feeling of carrying guilt for things beyond their control, of being paralyzed by fear of making wrong choices. Jennifer shared what she'd learned, not preaching or trying to convert anyone to belief in past lives, but simply offering perspective. Sometimes our fears aren't about the current situation. Sometimes we're carrying wounds from earlier in life, or from family patterns, or, if you believe in such things, from previous lifetimes. Understanding where the fear comes from can help release its power over us. She reconnected with her sister Emma, who she'd been distant from for years. The distance had started after their father died, and they'd disagreed about his end-of-life care. Jennifer had carried enormous guilt about those decisions, had convinced herself that she'd somehow failed their father. Emma had her own guilt and grief. They'd both been trapped in their separate pain, unable to connect. Now, Jennifer reached out. They met for coffee, and Jennifer shared her regression experience. Emma was skeptical about the past life aspect, but she listened. And then she said something that hit Jennifer hard. "You know, you've always been like this, even when we were kids. Anytime something bad happened, you'd blame yourself. Remember when our cat died? You were convinced it was your fault because you'd left the door open once, even though the cat died of old age months later. Or when Mom and Dad fought, you'd think it was because of something you'd done. You've always carried more than your share of responsibility." Jennifer realized her sister was right. The pattern hadn't started in past lives, or rather, it had been reinforced in this life by early experiences that resonated with the soul-level pattern. The two fed into each other, creating a loop that was hard to break. But now it was broken, or at least, significantly loosened. She wasn't perfect, still had moments of sliding back into old habits of guilt and over-responsibility, but she could catch herself now, could recognize when she was falling into the pattern, and consciously choose differently. She and Emma began to heal their relationship, slowly rebuilding the closeness they'd had before their father's death. It felt like a small miracle, this reconnection, and Jennifer understood that this was part of breaking the pattern too. In past lives, she'd lost people she loved and never forgiven herself. In this life, she could repair relationships, could reach out instead of withdrawing, could choose connection over isolation. Jennifer also started working with Dr. Torres on exploring other past lives, not looking for more trauma but looking for lives where she'd been strong, capable, successful. Because the pattern wasn't the only thing her soul has experienced. There were other lifetimes, other stories, other versions of herself who had faced challenges and overcome them, who had made good choices and experienced positive outcomes. She found a life as a healer in ancient Greece, a woman who had saved countless lives through her knowledge of herbs and remedies. She found a life as a teacher in China, sharing wisdom with students who went on to do great things. She found a life as a mother in Africa whose children had all survived to adulthood, who had died peacefully surrounded by grandchildren and great-grandchildren. These lives existed too. These stories were also part of her soul's journey, and accessing them helped balance the heavy, traumatic lives she'd been carrying in the forefront of her consciousness. She began to understand that her soul was complex, had experienced both tragedy and triumph, both failure and success. The pattern of impossible choices and guilt was real, but it wasn't the only pattern. It wasn't the totality of who she was across lifetimes. One night, about 6 months after her initial regression, Jennifer had a dream. She was back on that ship with Mary, but this time, she was also simultaneously Jennifer, aware of both identities at once. Mary was holding Bridget's body, refusing to let go, and Jennifer spoke to her across time. "You have to release her. Not just her body, but the guilt. You did your best. You loved her. That's all that matters. Let her go. Let the guilt go. It's time." And Mary looked up, tears streaming down her face, and nodded. She kissed her daughter's forehead one last time and allowed the sailors to take the body. As Bridget disappeared into the ocean, instead of breaking, Mary felt something lifting. The crushing weight she'd been carrying began to ease. Jennifer woke from the dream with the understanding that healing could happen across time. By forgiving herself now, in this current life, she was somehow also healing Mary, healing James, healing all the versions of herself who had carried this burden. Time wasn't as linear as it seemed. Consciousness existed outside of time, and choices made now could ripple backward and forward, affecting past and future simultaneously. It was a mystery, something she couldn't fully understand with her rational mind. But she could feel its truth, could feel the release happening not just in her current awareness but at deeper levels, in layers of consciousness that stretched across lifetimes. She thought about Mary often, about that woman who had loved her children so fiercely, who had made an impossible choice and then suffered the consequences. And instead of judgment, Jennifer felt only compassion. Mary had done her best. They all had done their best. Every version of herself across every lifetime had been trying to love, trying to protect, trying to make good choices with limited information and resources. That was enough. It had to be enough, because perfection wasn't possible. Control wasn't possible. The only thing possible was showing up with love and doing your best and then forgiving yourself when things didn't work out perfectly. That was the lesson. That was what she'd been trying to learn across all these lifetimes. And finally, she understood. Some souls carry patterns across lifetimes, repeating situations until they learn what they need to learn. If you recognized yourself in this story, if you carry guilt for outcomes you couldn't control, if you feel like you keep facing the same impossible choices over and over, maybe it's time to see the pattern clearly. Maybe it's time to forgive yourself for being human, for being limited, for not being able to save everyone or prevent all suffering. You did your best. You are doing your best. That's all any of us can do. And it's enough. You are enough. Subscribe for more souls remembering what they came here to learn.